So a little bit about myself, my own history. As a child, I remember going to Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation, but I have to admit that my devotional life was rather lacking. I prayed the rosary, but usually only at the vigil before a funeral, reciting all 15 decades in Spanish at lightning speed because that's what we did. And this, of course, was before the luminous mysteries were introduced by Pope St. John Paul II. So the lack of devotion was due in part to the fact that I was raised both Catholic on my father's side and Protestant on my mother's. So while I was never discouraged from learning about the many devotional practices of our Catholic faith, the truth is my parents just really couldn't teach me. My dad worked a graveyard shift, so he was asleep during the day, and my mom, being raised Protestant, just didn't know our traditions. And then when I was about 10 years old, something changed. I saw the Song of Bernadette for the first time on American Movie Classics, back when American Movie Classics actually showed movies instead of TV shows. And the movie tells a story of Bernadette Soubirous, a young French girl who beheld numerous visions of Our Lady near the village of Lourdes, France in 1858. And from that day on, I wanted to visit the Grotto of Massabielle and to discover the mystery of this beautiful lady who appeared to Bernadette and referred to herself as the Immaculate Conception. And the experience really sparked a desire in me, and it was something I couldn't really describe. I just knew I had a goal. I was going towards somewhere. And thankfully, I was finally able to go to Lourdes in 2005. Before World Youth Day in Germany, I went with a pilgrimage group, and we stopped there first, and that really helped my devotion. But that was many years later, obviously. In fact, it wasn't until I was around 20 that I really began to explore the Church's rich tradition of devotions and pious exercises. So I was in college. I went through the RCIA process to be confirmed because I hadn't done that when I was younger. And so as I started to learn more about our faith and the intellectual components, I also started to dive into all the rich traditions and history and devotions that we have. And so over time, I began, especially the Rosary, began making a number of them part of my own spiritual practices. So nowadays, I get teased a little bit by some of the brothers because I pray so many novenas throughout the year that I have to keep a calendar to keep track of what I'm doing when. So of course, there is Our Lady of Lourdes in February. So every year, and the funny thing is people are like, well, you're praying the same novena. And I was like, it is the same, but it's completely different. So every year, the prayers are always from here for each day, and I read from this book a chapter each day for each prayer. And even though I've done this for many years now, every year I learn something new about the Lord, about Mary, about Bernadette, and it's something that really helps my prayer life. In October, Novena to St. Jude, which is a big thing at the St. Jude Shrine in San Francisco. I have a novena to St. Peregrine that I pray every time I learn about someone suffering from cancer. Of course, there is the original novena before Pentecost, which I always start on Ascension Thursday, even though Ascension is transferred to Sunday in most places, because you cannot pray a 9-day novena in 7 days. It just doesn't work. And then in September, I have a novena to St. Michael and companions, which is part of a 30-day reflection I do for the angels. So Michael is my religious name, just as Gabriel is Father's religious name. So we like to tease one another and things like that, because his feast day is actually in March in the old calendar. So anyway, it's a reflection on the angels and especially devotion to my patron, St. Michael. And then a few years ago, I started praying a marriage novena, which I prepared myself for couples who are getting ready for their wedding day. So it's a combination of prayers from the actual liturgy, so blessing of engaged couple or the prayer at the Mass for a wedding. It includes scriptural passages, obviously from the liturgy, as well as reflections from different saints on marriage and the family and things like that. So it was just a way that I could more closely enter into what my friends and family were preparing for and offer to them, because I cannot afford, $80 china for a wedding gift sort of thing. Especially, I was a youth minister before I entered the order, so a lot of those young people are now young adults getting married, and last year alone I went to like 7 weddings within the course of a couple months, and I was like, I'll just pray. That's what I can do. So all that being said, I was still a bit hesitant when invited to share with you about liturgy, devotions, and pious practices. I'm not an expert. The church's tradition is so rich, and there are so many devotions and practices that I don't think anyone can really grasp them all. But I spent a great deal of time studying them, learning about them, and the church's teaching on their role in our lives. So hopefully today can be an opportunity for all of us to learn from one another, as I'm sure there are many pious practices that you're aware of that I have yet to discover. So hopefully we can chat about some of those later. But first, I think it's necessary to clarify some terms. Although we tend to use them interchangeably, the Church actually makes a distinction between pious exercises, devotions, and popular piety. So most of the time we just use the same term to describe everything, but there is a distinction. So popular piety is associated with those expressions of faith that are not inspired by the liturgy, the Church's public act of worship, but by a particular nation or culture. So how these expressions are manifested depends on the local ordinary. It's his responsibility to make sure they're in accord with the Church's teaching and that they don't supersede the liturgy. For example, I'm Mexican on my father's side, so we tend to celebrate Dia de los Muertos. And we set up a little altar with offerings and candles and photos and relics of our loved ones and family members. So that coincides with All Souls Day, but it should never take the place of All Souls Day. Pious exercises, on the other hand, is used to describe public or private expressions of the Christian faith which are inspired by the liturgy and lead people to it. And then similarly, we have devotions, which refers to specifically to those practices attached to particular times or places, insignia, medals, and so forth. And though they're distinct from liturgical prayer, devotions and pious exercises are often reflective of the sacramental life of the Church and her liturgical calendar. So something like lighting the candles of an Advent wreath doesn't necessarily have to be part of the liturgy. It can be something that you do at home with your family, right? But it's connected to what's going on in the Church's life during the liturgical calendar especially. And they're often connected to the celebration of the sacraments and sacramentals in some way. So I like to use Good Friday as an example of what I mean, since some people get confused. So the liturgy of that day is the Liturgy of the Lord's Passion, part of the Triduum. The Stations of the Cross, Passion Plays, Divine Mercy Novena, and Reflections on the Seven Last Words are all devotions and exercises which are secondary to the liturgy. So many of them draw from the liturgy, from the prayers, from the readings, and things like that. And they help us to be more focused on God during the liturgy, but they should never take precedence, right? They're supposed to be secondary to the liturgy. That's what we come together to do first. So for more on this, you can look at the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments. In 2001, they published the Directory on Popular Piety and the Liturgy Principles and Guidelines. And it's a long document. I tried to cut some pieces to help you understand, but it also gives a number of examples of these devotions and practices and things like that. More on the history, how a number of them developed during the Middle Ages, more on the different confraternities and their specific practices and things like that. So it's a great document. You can find it online very easily. But at this point, I want to shift gears a little bit and look more closely at some examples, specifically those devotions and pious exercises that are promoted by the Order of Preachers and its members, both the friars, the sisters, and the Dominican laity. So being where we are, I'm sure that all of you are aware of the Rosary and the Rosary Confraternity, which Dominicans have promoted for centuries. This is one of the greatest devotions of the Church, and not simply because of its meditative nature, the profession of the Creed, reflection on special moments of the life of Christ and Mary, the recitation of the Our Fathers, Hail Marys, and Glory Bees. More than that, the Rosary is a powerful weapon in our spiritual arsenal. So St. Dominic learned this himself 800 years ago. One day, while reflecting on the lack of success he was having in converting the Albigensians, our Blessed Mother appeared to him. And what did she say? She said, "Wonder not that you have obtained so little fruit by your labors. You have spent them on barren soil, not yet watered with the dew of divine grace. When God willed to renew the face of the earth, he began by sending down on it the fertilizing rain of the angelic salutation. Therefore, preach my psalter composed of 150 angelic salutations, and 15 Our Fathers, and you will obtain an abundant harvest. So this really is the start of the Rosary in our tradition. And so we see this when we have statues of the Blessed Mother and the Christ child giving the Rosary to St. Dominic. And just for a lot of people who get confused, often we see St. Catherine on the other side, right? Well, that doesn't make sense chronologically because they existed far apart, right, in terms of the centuries. And yet it's a reflection of Catherine meditating on this story of Mary giving the Rosary to Dominic. So, not surprisingly, another Dominican, Pope Pius V, really understood the power of the Rosary. And as Pope, he established the Feast of Our Lady of Victory in 1571, which later became the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, attributing the Christian Armada's defeat of the Turkish fleet at the Battle of Lepanto to the intercession of the Blessed Mother and the prayers of the Rosary Confraternity in Rome. So, I'm sure, again, being here, you all know this story, having Father Duffner and Father Reginald and all the others who have come through and told you the stories before. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on that, but you can ask me more later. The truth is, outside of the Dominican world, many people are unaware of these stories, right? So at the very least, they're aware that the Rosary changes lives. They know that every encounter with the Blessed Mother changes lives. She who blesses us with joy and healing, who calls us to conversion, who protects us from harm, and leads us to her Son. For really, what son would turn away from his mother when she looks upon him with loving eyes and asks for a favor? I'm an only child, so I know that whenever my mom calls my cell phone, I either call her back shortly after or at least text her to say, I will get back to you soon. You do not ignore your mother. But I think St. Bernard of Clairvaux, although not a Dominican, puts it rather well. He says, in dangers, in doubts, in difficulties, think of Mary, call upon Mary. While invoking her, you shall never lose heart. So long as she is in your mind, you are safe from deception. While she holds your hand, you cannot fall. Under her protection, you have nothing to fear. If she walks before you, you shall not grow weary. If she shows you favor, you shall reach the goal. That goal, of course, being her Son, Jesus Christ. Like the Rosary, Dominicans are also responsible for promoting the angelic warfare confraternity and devotion to St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, the confraternity came about as a result of a profound moment in the life of the saint during his youth. Shortly after joining the order of preachers, Thomas was kidnapped by his family, who hoped that he would leave the Dominicans, which at the time were a new order, looked upon suspiciously by the bishops because the friars were allowed to preach, and looked upon suspiciously by the nobility because the friars were mendicant beggars. Right? So Thomas's family locked him in a tower, and his brothers hired a woman of ill repute to tempt him away from his vocation. When the woman arrived, Thomas grabbed a red-hot firebrand out of the fireplace and chased her out of the room, slamming the door and then making the sign of the cross in it with the firebrand. He thanked God for preserving his chastity, and then experienced a vision of two angels girding him with a cord of purity, which he wore until his death. And he didn't actually share this story until his final confession. Eventually, the cord was entrusted to the Dominican nuns at the convent of St. Margaret in Vercelli, and they began distributing similar cords which had touched the miraculous cord to the faithful who desired to maintain a chaste life. And this went on for some time. So in some ways you would call this probably one of those acts of popular piety. So it wasn't connected to the liturgy at all, but it was a story, and it was something that was helping people who wanted to grow in chastity. And so this was going on, but it had no formal approval yet. And actually that lasted for about 500 years. The church is slow in some things, or at least the Dominicans are sometimes. So in 1727, we finally received ecclesial approval for the Angelic Warfare Confraternity. And Pope Benedict XIII granted permission to wear a cord or a medal. So I am actually a member of the confraternity, and if I can get to my medal, I have it here. On one side is the image of the vision of St. Thomas Aquinas receiving the cord, and the other is an image of St. Dominic receiving the rosary. So the basic requirements are very simple. It involves enrollment in a ceremony, the wearing of the cord or medal in perpetuity, and daily prayers for chastity. 15 Hail Marys for members of the confraternity and those who are struggling with purity, as well as the prayer of St. Thomas Aquinas for purity and a prayer to St. Thomas Aquinas for purity. And for those of you who know a number of the young people here from the parish who have gone to Ignite Your Torch Youth Rally this summer or the last few summers, a number of them have joined the confraternity as well. So they're hoping to grow in the virtue of chastity and praying for other members of the confraternity as well as for everybody who's struggling with that. In today's hypersexualized society, it's really important. The confraternity is more important than ever. Pornography and the like distorts the beauty of the human body and the gift of our sexuality. And people are turned into objects, and love is replaced by lust for so many people. So devotion to St. Thomas Aquinas and the pious exercises of the Angelic Warfare Confraternity reminds all of us that God calls us to live chaste lives, whether we're single, married, or consecrated religious. Now, in addition to these two rather large examples, Dominicans have also made other devotions and pious exercises a part of our spirituality throughout the centuries. So the little office of the Blessed Virgin Mary, numerous litanies, special processions, even the way that we chant the Salve Regina with our own tones. These have all become a part of our tradition. We even have special blessings for objects, which there are a lot in the Book of Blessings, but Dominicans have our own for a number of things. So there's a special Dominican blessing of rosaries, blessing of roses for the Society of the Most Holy Rosary, blessing of candles, blessing of scapulars and garments. What else is in here? The blessing of the cords and medals of St. Thomas Aquinas for the Angelic Warfare Confraternity. There's a blessing of water with the relic of St. Peter Martyr, blessing of olive oil and palm branches on the feast of St. Peter Martyr, blessings of the prayers of St. Vincent Fair, and then that's just a few that are in this book. So it's a wonderful thing. So you can talk to Father Gabriel or Father Vincent if you want the special Dominican blessing of your rosary or things like that, because these are things reserved to Dominicans. So moving on from there. So those are some of the basics, and we can talk about some of those, but I want to get to something now that should surprise me, and at the same time not, in my research of these various exercises, especially in the life of the Order of Preachers, is our promotion to the devotion to the Sacred Heart, a task which is usually associated with the Jesuits, as well as St. Margaret Mary in the 1600s. And although we've never taken it on formally as we've done with the Rosary Confraternity and the Angelic Warfare Confraternity, it's actually been a part of our tradition since the early 1200s, promoted by the friars, the nuns, the sisters, and the Dominican laity. So here I have to give a lot of credit to my Dominican brothers, James Thulin, Urban Bergkamp, and Louis Every, who compiled a lot of the information I'm about to share. And I wish I had found James Thulin's article before, because he synthesized a lot of things from all over the place. But St. Albert the Great is one of the first Dominicans to specifically reference the Sacred Heart in his writings. In De Eucharistia, he writes, "The heart of our Lord is the golden ark of the covenant. Therein is preserved the manna of grace, which dispenses the Holy Eucharist to us. Love goes forth from a heart always consumed by it. Through a love which enkindled it like a fire, and wholly consumed it for those it loved, the divine heart was moved to prepare graces for us." So in the 1200s, long before St. Margaret Mary really promoted devotion to the Sacred Heart, St. Albert the Great was already speaking about it. And St. Albert was, of course, St. Thomas's mentor and instructor. Less than 100 years later, so in the 1300s, Meister Eckhart, John Tauler, and Blessed Henry Suso, all Dominicans, commonly referred to as the Rhineland mystics, were spreading devotion to the Sacred Heart throughout Germany. So Tauler's work was recognized by St. John of the Cross, St. Peter Canisius, and St. Francis de Sales. And Blessed Henry's little book of eternal wisdom was translated and copied by hand more often than the Imitation of Christ throughout Europe for a time. So in his little book, we find the Lord saying to Henry, Consider all hearts, and see if there was one filled with love as mine has been. I should wish, in place of all the members of my body, to have but one, and that the noblest, the heart. Around the same time in Italy, St. Vincent Ferrer referred to the Sacred Heart as the shrine of reconciliation between God and man. And St. Antoninus, who was in Florence, in one of his sermons declared, "Fly therefore as a dove on the wings of holy meditation, and consider the wounds of Christ, the large wound of the side and the open heart whence issued blood and water. He loved you and every rational creature with a love so strong that there is no tongue that can express it." So all the friars are involved in this movement at the time. Probably one of the most well-known female preachers of the Sacred Heart in Italy or otherwise, next to St. Margaret, is St. Catherine of Siena. So in her dialogue, she frequently refers to union with the Sacred Heart. And at one point, records a conversation with our Lord, which I really think epitomizes this devotion. She says, "O Immaculate Lamb, you were dead when your side was opened. Why did you wish to be struck and wounded in the heart?" Christ's response, "That you should remember there were sufficient reasons which I had. I wished you to see the secret of my heart, shown open that you could see that I loved more than I could show by finite pains." So again, she really helped share this devotion along with Raymond of Capua, her advisor and confessor, as she visited the Pope in Avignon and so many throughout Europe. She helped spread this devotion. In more recent years, and by that I mean the 1800s, it was the work of the Dominicans in France that helped establish the famous Basilica of Sacré-Cœur. So in 1847, Father Jean-Baptiste Henri Dominique Lacordaire gave a sermon about making reparation to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which inspired Dominican tertiaries such as Monsignor Royal de Fleury in Poitiers. So he approached the master of the order at that time, Father Jean d'Al, and then Pope Pius IX about building a church dedicated to the Sacred Heart as a national act of reparation. Both were in favor. And in fact, Father Jean d'Al was so in favor that he moved to have the order consecrated to the Sacred Heart shortly thereafter. So in the following years, in addition to the order being consecrated, Dominican tertiaries like Royal de Fleury and Émile Camer helped move the project forward, resulting in the church's consecration in 1919. So if you ever get a chance to go to France, to Paris specifically, please take an opportunity to visit Sacré-Cœur up on the hill. It's a little bit of a walk if you choose to go up the steps, but there's also kind of a tram up the side. And it's a beautiful church. And in fact, I didn't recognize the connection until much later. When I went to, as I said, World Youth Day in Germany and to Lourdes, we had gone to Paris first. And so I went up to Sacré-Cœur as part of the pilgrimage, and I went to, they have perpetual adoration, and they also have confession going on all the time. And while I had been working at a Dominican parish, because I knew all the staff and all the friars, I didn't go to confession with any of the Dominican friars, because that would have just been awkward. So I ended up going to confession in Sacré-Cœur, and who was my confessor? A Polish Dominican who happened to be in France at the time, who spoke English very well, although he was embarrassed. And I said, "You speak English better than most English speakers, so please don't be." But that was my first time going to confession with a Dominican, and it happened to be in the Basilica of Sacré-Cœur. So there's all these connections going on for me. I'm just realizing right now, this is great. In any case, as you can see, devotion to the Sacred Heart in the order of preachers is not something new. So the heart of Jesus, a symbol of Christ's human nature, is a huge part of Dominican spirituality, right? It makes sense considering the fact that the order was founded to combat the heresy of Catharism. And so the Catharists taught that all of reality was a result of a conflict between a good God and a bad God, right? The good God was seen as having created the spiritual realm, and the bad God as having created all physical matter. And according to the Catharists, all physical matter was evil, including the human body, which was thought of as a prison for the soul. And obviously this was in direct contradiction to the true Christian faith, which professed belief in one God who created all things and saw that it was good. So the Dominicans from the very beginning knew how important the human nature of Christ was in our mission of converting the Cathars and the Albigensians. So I think it's just this profound thing that's going on in all the devotional life of the church and all of our pious exercises. Dominicans have been involved in some way, not in all of them, but in some of these major ones that have really moved the church forward by leaps and bounds, right? Everybody knows the rosary. More people are growing aware of the angelic warfare confraternity. In almost every church you go to, there's a statue of the Sacred Heart. So it's just a wonderful thing for us as Dominicans, as we celebrate 800 years of our history, to recognize the effects that we've had on the devotional life of the church, and how the many graces that have come from this, both for us and for the church as a whole. Now I want to leave a few minutes for questions or things like that before we move into the next talk. Obviously, throughout the day, if you have questions or think of something, we can do that as well. But I want to cut off here because I want to give you a chance to ask anything if I didn't explain something clearly, or if there's something you'd like to add or other thoughts. So please, go ahead. Yes? Mm-hmm. I'm not. As I said, I make my own kind of reflection during the month of September on the angels, but I'm not actually involved in that confraternity. So, but I can get you some information on that if you're interested. Oh, you are a member. Okay, well, good. Then maybe we can chat a little more later, and I can learn some more. Yes.
When I was living in California, my prayer group there, we got together and we went to each other's houses, and we enthroned the house of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in a series of prayers. Do you know of that, the enthronement of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in your home, and do you know where we can find the prayers here?
You know, I've heard of the tradition. I haven't learned that much about it. I can probably look around. There's lots of things, especially now so many things are getting put online, some of the older prayer books and things like that. We could probably find the information, yeah. So that's a good point. One of the things to clarify, in terms of devotions and these practices and things like that, as I said, all these exercises are under the jurisdiction of the local ordinary, so he should be making sure that they're in line with the church's teachings and things like that, and that the prayers that we use are in accord with what the church teaches and believes. It's really not our job as individuals necessarily to push, to promote something that hasn't been recognized by the church, especially if it's something that's more individual for us. So, as I said, the novena for married couples that I do is based on everything is either from the scriptures, from a writing of the saint, or the prayers that are already approved, which is the only reason I would feel comfortable sharing it with other people. If I had just made up the prayers myself, I would be a bit more hesitant, because I would want to make sure someone else had a chance to look over them and say, you know, to receive an imprimatur or nihil obstat, whatever it is, you know, yes, you are in line with what the church teaches. So just to be aware of that, as I said, the tradition that you mentioned is one that's...
We had a priest in our church.
Right, yeah. And so typically the priest, you know, can say, yes, this is, if he's participating, you would hope that the devotion is public and people are aware of it, so, and approved. Yes? Yes. Yes. So that was St. Michael and Companions, a little bit of a joke amongst my classmate and I. When we were novices at St. Dominic's in San Francisco, Father Michael Hurley, who is the pastor there, was preaching on the Feast of the Archangels, and he referred to it as the Feast of St. Michael and Companions, because in the old calendar, St. Michael was the only one celebrated on September 29th. St. Gabriel was celebrated on March 24th, the day before the Annunciation. And St. Raphael is, I believe, in July. I have to check. I'll look in my calendar here in a second. So that's what I meant by that. But during the month of September, I make, here, I'll pull out the book. It's basically 30 days of readings and prayers. And then specifically during the 20th and the 29th, I make it's basically praying the prayer to St. Michael. In connection with the readings, because those 9 days of readings really reflect on his role in the life of the church. So that was that one. This book is actually from Tan Publishing. It's rather old and hard to find, unfortunately, but if you'd like to take a look at it today, I'm happy to let you take a look, as long as I get it back. So it's 30 days because there's just a reflection for each day of the month, right? And then in October we have the Feast of Guardian Angels, so it kind of ends with that, it ties together. So, yes?
I've seen an actual confraternity of St. Michael, scapulars, but I've not been very successful in finding out much about it. Is that different from the general angelic confraternity?
Yes, the Angelic Warfare Confraternity is specifically to promote chastity and purity, whereas the St. Michael Confraternity focuses on defending the church against the attacks of Satan. So they're two different things. Yeah. Yes?
So you mentioned there's lots of little devotions that Dominicans have come up with over the years. Is there a good resource for that, especially for us lay Dominicans to find some of those things that we might be drawn to?
Yes. Actually, Father Augustine Thompson from our province, who some of you may know, writes a number of things for New Liturgical Movement. So he's put some of those things online, some of those books. If you're able to find, this was given to me, an older Dominican breviary by one of our fathers when he, shortly before he passed away. So this is where, again, all these blessings of various objects and things like that are. So some of these are in our libraries and archives and things like that. You might have to check with the friars to see if you can borrow them and things like that. Every once in a while, something pops up on like eBay or Amazon. So if you want to set up, email alerts, those do come up every once in a while. So someone over here had their hand too.
Father, being of Mexican descent, could you visualize what may happen if the election goes the wrong way in this country with proposed suppression of religious freedom? They would have a friada here like they had in Mexico under President Plutarco Calles, when they killed thousands of priests and bishops and cristeros revolted against them to defend the church. Could you visualize something like that happening in this country with the Masons supporting it?
I'm not sure. I would think in some places, as was the case in Poland or other countries where the church became oppressed, a number of things went underground, right? So you still had clandestine masses and things like that. At the same time, the way our government works here in the United States, we have a number of legal opportunities and things, organizations and people like that who are still defending the right to the right for religious liberty. So I'm not necessarily sure it would become that dramatic. I don't think it would necessarily turn into a civil war, but definitely in terms of legal battles, I could see that going on. So, yes?
Was Blessed Alan a Dominican, and what was his involvement with the Rosary?
Alan de la Roche, is that who you're referring to?
Is he blessed?
I think he's a blessed.
But maybe not a Dominican.
I know he was connected to the Dominicans. I can't remember if he was a tertiary or not. I'd have to do a little more research. I don't have that in my notes right here. Father Gabriel.
Yeah, so a couple things. Yes, the founder of the confraternity, and he was a Dominican. He's in our window, so he's a tertiary.
Yeah.
You can tell because he has hair.
He's not tonsured.
And as far as social persecution was concerned, this is part of the devotional life, right? So the Blessed Mother has asked us to pray the Rosary to stave off those sort of chastisements. So this goes into the devotional life. The third thing is, if you're looking for specific Dominican things, another good resource is the Dominican mission manuals.
That's
the
true.
Dominican mission manuals have a lot of things like that. You can get, I believe, you can get that from the Rosary Center.
Get it from the Rosary Center or the preaching office. And actually, Father Gerald Buckley is one of the major writers of the Dominican Mission Manual here in our province. So
That's right. So
you can ask him yourself.
If you want any devotional items, you can probably get it across the street at the Rosary Center. So, and they'd be appreciative.
Well, I'm out of time for now, but again, there's time throughout the day to ask questions during the breaks or lunch or things like that. But I want to give us time to get on to our next speaker. So thank you very much for having me today and for joining us to celebrate the 800th anniversary of the Order.